Hello and welcome to Bandwidth Conversations, a podcast that finds out about the stories and journeys of artists, performers, and rock stars of life. I am Katie Brewer, and today's conversation is thanks to the New College Society of Oxford University, and my guest is one of this country's best-loved novelists. He has written 20 sparkling books to date. His novels cover many aspects of life, but their essence is about family, relationships, of being human, frail, and vulnerable. One of the things that sets him apart is his ability to inhabit his characters to such an extent that the reader is swept along and feels huge empathy and understanding for each and every one of them. I cannot wait to find out quite how he does that. He is also a screenplay writer, and his screenplay Man in an Orange Shirt won an International Emmy Award for Best Movie Miniseries. I'm going to read a few comments about his writing and novels. Little short of miraculous, achingly believable, mesmerizing, enfolding us while we are reading it in a well-woven comfort blanket. He paints his characters richly, drawing out their contradictions, hopes, shortcomings, and humanity. His writing has an unmatched ability to take you by the hand and just casually, quietly lead you in. He is an artistic director of the North Cornwall Book Festival, patron of the Penzance Literary Festival and the Charles Causley Trust, and a founder-director of the arts charity Andelienta. I am so excited to have the chance to talk today to Patrick Gale. Hello, Patrick.
Hello, Katie.
Well, listen, I normally start at the beginning of people's lives and I say, and then this happened. But inspired by your novels, whose chapters aren't necessarily in chronological order, I'm going to try something a little bit different, which works brilliantly for you, may not work so well for me. But I'd like to start with two of your novels that I read recently, Rough Music and Notes from an Exhibition. In Rough Music, it's set in Cornwall, in a cottage, same family, but the story swings between two timescales about 30 years apart. What was the inspiration behind that?
Well, partly Cornwall. I love Cornwall dearly, and that novel is set in a very thinly disguised version of New Polzeth, where I went as a young boy and just fell in love with the landscape, the beach, the whole sort of arty culture of the place. But also I've long been obsessed with memory and the way different members of the same family will have completely different recollections of what historically were the same events. And anyone with siblings will recognize the syndrome. I mean, I have two surviving siblings and we're all quite old now. And when we start talking about our childhood, it's very weird because it's sometimes as if we had different childhoods. I'm like a frustrated psychotherapist. I love digging back into my characters' pasts to gently point up the gaps in their memory and the gaps in their understanding.
Well, I think that's something that's very lovely about what you do, is you do sort of shine a spotlight on someone's perspective, and then a few chapters later, you'll come back and you'll shine a different light on it.
Yeah.
And how much of your upbringing went into that book? Because there are some similarities between you and the young Julian.
There are. That was the first novel of mine. I was about to turn 40 when I wrote that one. And it's the first novel in which I actively draw on my own family. So the mother and the father in that book are very closely based on my own parents, complete with the fact that they seem on the face of it to be wildly unsuited, because the mother is artistic and outgoing, extrovert, and the father is profoundly introverted, rather academic. And as in reality, the father is a prison governor and the mother is a daughter of a prison governor, because in real life, my father married the boss's daughter.
Oh, did he? I didn't realize that.
Yeah, so my mother was, I think, in her 40s before she lived in a house on a street without guards and high walls.
Wow.
It does do something to you, because in those days, the governor's family lived in the prison. You were very much behind the walls and you had daily access and daily contact with prisoners. So I think she, rather sweetly, when they retired from Wandsworth Prison, which was their final prison, the officers' wives clubbed together and bought my mother a truncheon to keep under her bed. And she always did. It was until she went into an old people's home, that truncheon was always on her bed, because she was so nervous of no longer having guards patrolling outside the house. But there you go.
Oh my gosh. And so did you grow up inside the prison walls as well?
Yeah. My earliest memories of the garden and house at Wandsworth. I've gone back since, and it is pretty enormous, actually. So although your childhood memories always make houses extra big, it seemed completely huge to me as a toddler. And my mother corroborated later that, like almost every governor's house on the circuit, and they had to move every 5 years, Wandsworth had far more rooms than they could furnish. So as small children, we had access to this magical kind of playground of the house. And my big brothers were very naughty, and like little Julian in that novel, Rough Music, they would also climb out onto the roof of the prison.
Oh, they did that.
So my mother had a terrible memory of coming home one day from shopping in Sloane Street or whatever, and hearing this strange tapping sound, and she looked up from the hall, and high above there was a glass dome over the stairwell, and my brothers were waving at her from outside the glass, which was heaven knows how old and probably quite rotten anyway.
Well, I remember those moments as a mother, and of course your children are just so gleeful that they've done something so brilliant.
Time, yes. Yeah. You have to talk them gently down. Yeah. Not the thing my mother was ever very good at doing. And we were at Wandsworth when Ronnie Biggs escaped.
In fact, in the bit at the back where you talk about Ronnie Biggs, and you were there at that time.
We were there at that time. It was my father's night off. He and my mother went to the theatre, and we were being babysat by an aunt. And the breakout happened while he was out at the theatre, poor man. And so for years afterwards, whenever there was a colour supplement article about Ronnie whooping it up in Brazil, my father would grind his teeth.
I'm sure.
But then I found this lovely coincidence that Ronnie Biggs, the thing he missed most about England was Cornwall, because it turns out as a little boy, he had been evacuated during the Second World War. His school had been evacuated to Cornwall. So he had these precious memories of those Cornish lanes piled high with primroses.
You can't recreate that in South America.
Far too hot for primroses.
Yes, absolutely. You're the youngest of 4 children, and being in amongst this sort of prison community, what kind of conversations were you having around the dinner table?
My father and mother were very careful to make sure we were never frightened. So we knew the prisoners were there because they'd broken the law. We didn't know the details of what they'd done or anything, and it was very bad form to ask. But we knew they were there because they were ostensibly bad men. But my dad was extremely principled about prison. He felt the prison itself was not the punishment. The prison was the cure. And he believed that their time in prison was one of recuperation, and he wanted to release them as better men than they had come in. So he always made sure, if at all possible, every man in his prisons would gain a qualification or learn a language or learn a skill or something. And of course, in those days, the prisons weren't crowded the way they are now. So this was possible. There was always a factory. So at Wandsworth, along one side of the garden, there was a factory where the prisoners sewed mail bags for the Royal Mail. And they could chat to us out of the window. My mother remembered overhearing me having a long conversation with one of the prisoners. She could only hear my side of it, but apparently it broke off with me indignantly saying, "I'm not curly, I'm a nice little boy." So I don't know what had gone before. But apparently we all of us in turn were sent back from our nursery school with notes saying, "Please do something about your child's language," because the prisoners delighted in teaching us to swear like troopers because we were such posh little children. I think they thought it was terribly funny.
Oh, that's brilliant. And then you go to boarding school at the age of 8, again, like young Julian. And how did you find that experience?
Quite strange, because on the one hand, it was familiar, having grown up in an institution. Moving to another institution, there was something about it, about being locked up at night and being in this big building and all these old houses was familiar. But I was desperately homesick. And that took me a long time to get over that. The thing that cured me, I think, was music. It was a music school at Winchester. So I was doing hours of music every day, and that was utterly beguiling. And I was also singing in the Winchester College Chapel every day, which is a spectacularly beautiful place. So there were compensations, I suppose, for missing home. And boarding school does something quite violent, I think, to a young child, in that it, in a way, is a brutal lesson almost immediately. You get there in the fallibility of your parents. So I realized as I was getting over my homesickness that my parents had let me down big time. They'd taken me to this place and left me there. And I think that meant that I raced ahead of my older siblings in terms of understanding our parents. I stopped requiring anything of them emotionally at quite an early age. Whereas my brothers who didn't go to boarding school and my sister, I think it took them longer to realize our parents were only human and probably couldn't deliver the goods. Maybe deep down, that's what boarding school is for. No, I don't think they noticed it happening. I noticed it happening because as I got older, I would see my brothers having temper tantrums and behaving in ways which to my eyes seemed quite immature. But I think that's what boarding school does. I mean, it's pretty brutal to do that to an 8-year-old, but that's how it worked.
8 is so terribly young.
We see my father was sent to boarding school at 5. So he had a wet nurse from birth and then was handed over to a boarding school at 5. So I think he thought I'd been raised quite softly, really, not starting till 7.5 or whatever I was.
And how come you went to boarding school and your siblings didn't?
Because I could sing. A music teacher at Dulwich College Prep School, which was my first proper little school, turned around to my mother one day and said, he's got a good voice and he can hold a melody and he's got a good musical memory. You should think about putting him in for voice trials. She'd never heard of this. She didn't know what voice trials were. He helped her research it and they found that actually if I got one of these choristerships at Winchester, all my fees would be paid for 5 years. And I would learn 2 instruments free of charge. I mean, it was a no-brainer because I was, as the youngest of 4. I think they were running out of money for school fees. As it was, I think various bits of old silver were taken out of the bank vaults and sold to pay for this and that by the time I came along.
Moving on to Notes from an Exhibition, which I also loved. I've had such a lovely time, Patrick, reading your books and listening to the last one, which we'll come to. Notes from an Exhibition. It's set in Penzance, story of Rachel Kelly, who is an artist, mother, and suffers from bipolar disorder. And those swings that you describe in that book, kind of the razor blade moments, and how the children are sort of always treading on eggshells and always watching. How did you know?
I did a lot of research into the bipolar disorder and its effects and its treatment. But I think anyone who has had either a sibling or a parent who has been mentally ill or simply very, very ill physically will understand the syndrome I describe in the book, whereby it distorts the family structure. The whole polarity of the family changes when especially a parent who you would normally look to for emotional nurturing and support suddenly requires emotional support from you. So the polarity changes. So on one level, it was something I recognized because my mother was ill, not mentally, although she did get very depressed at times, physically ill for a lot of my childhood, to the point where it became the kind of ruling thing in the household.
Was that something that she had always that happened?
When I was 10 years old, she and I and one of my brothers were in a very bad car crash that almost killed her.
Oh, gosh.
And she sustained really bad whiplash injury. This was in the days before headrests and cars and seatbelts and all that stuff. And she had such bad whiplash injury that her brain stem was twisted. It's a miracle she didn't die. She had to learn to walk and talk and swallow and all that again. She also, according to my older siblings, underwent a character change. So they said that she was not the same person when she came out of hospital finally. I was less good at judging this, not least because I've been away at boarding school for the last few years. But one of the great changes was she became profoundly religious. She said that she had died in hospital briefly and left her body. She claimed she looked down on her body from the corner of the room, but that she then heard a voice saying, "Go back, it's not time," or whatever. And she got quite a lot of mileage out of that in religious terms. And I think her religion was genuine. But my God, it was extreme. It felt extreme to us because it was a big change from Sunday religion, from just putting on a hat and going to church on Sunday. Suddenly there was, Jesus was in the house with us on a daily basis, which took some adjusting to. It was easier for me because I was in a profoundly religious school. So I was going to church, as part of my duties as a choir boy. I think it was much harder on my older siblings. And there were tremendous rows and arguments and differences of opinion. But all very good fodder for a novelist.
Yes. There's that sort of heartbreaking moment, which I just kind of thought, gosh, I wonder if this is autobiographical, when Garfield, and it's his birthday, and he has to go and see Rachel, his mother, who is in hospital, and he is very good about it. But at one point, she hasn't even said happy birthday to him, and he's just angry because this is supposed to be his day and another day has been ruined. And I didn't know whether that was something you had experienced because it felt so real.
It's a version of something I experienced because in that same terrible year when my mum almost died, one of my siblings became suicidally depressed and repeatedly tried to kill themselves. And they had, poor thing, I mean, they went through the full gamut of 1970s psychiatric experimental, largely, treatments, from electroconvulsive therapy to deep sleep therapy. And I remember that the deep sleep therapy was administered in a really grim old psychiatric hospital outside Winchester, a place called Park Pruitt near Basingstoke. And I think because I was the only member of the family who hadn't lost their trust, I was taken out of boarding school to go and visit the sibling in this hospital. And I had no preparation at all. Nobody said it's going to be frightening. Nobody said they're going to be so drugged they won't really be able to speak. So that the whole experience was really very grim indeed, probably a lot grimmer than what I described in that chapter about poor Garfield. But yes, it was. You were right to recognize it as something lived. It was lived. It took me a long time. That was written many years after the experience, but my God, it came back to me. I think families can be, it's something I quite often write about. They can be quite brutal, often in the name of love. For the best possible reasons, they could do really terrible things. And that's something I write about quite often. And I think in Notes from an Exhibition, one of the reasons why that book seems to do very well with reading groups is that they can argue endlessly about which of the parents is the better parent or the worst parent. Because the father in that novel, on the face of it, a very saintly man, always puts his wife before the children. Always, always, always. And that is often really not appropriate. And I was quite keen not to make him a totally good father. And in that one aspect, I think the children are often exposed to things they're not ready to see.
No. And then it plays out later on in their lives.
Absolutely, yes. Nothing gets hidden forever in a family, but sometimes it takes 15 years to come up.
Yeah. Did you talk about it?
We were English. Nothing gets talked about. Nobody discusses it. And this is before the days of counselling or anything like that. So clearly my little boarding school knew what was going on, and they had decided the best thing for young Gale was to pretend that nothing was going on. So there was no feedback, no counselling, nothing at all. It was just life as normal, punctuated by these occasional trips to a psychiatric hospital. And in those days, this is the early 70s, there was still a lot of stigma attached to mental illness. So I picked up on that and felt actually this wasn't something I could even tell my friends about, really.
Oh my gosh, you had to keep it completely to yourself.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. And it was only when I was in my late teens that one of another member of the family let slip in front of me some detail to do with suicide attempts, which I'd never had confirmed. I'd sort of guessed. There was a kind of intake of breath. And I suddenly realized, oh my God, they all agreed amongst themselves to keep the worst of it secret from me. Anyway, it's all out now.
And do you think that's partly why all your books seem to center around the relationships between parents and children, siblings?
Well, it's a bottomless subject, I think. It is a bottomless subject. And every family, if you don't have to dig very deep in any family, I think, to find unhappiness, misunderstanding, or secrets, because we're only human. And just as every marriage is a compromise, I think every attempt at being a parent will be compromised. You won't succeed entirely. And I think one of the things I find deeply touching about humanity is the way we We know that, but my God, we keep trying. We keep having children and we keep getting married and it keeps going wrong, but we do our best.
You're absolutely right. And also we all try and present a good front. So if you are the family that are going through tricky times, you can still, even nowadays, feel that you're the only ones failing at it.
I think nowadays it must be even worse in a family that's troubled because of social media. I mean, when I was a child, my mother was a really good photographer and she took photographs all the time. And she didn't just take the photographs, she stuck them into an album, only the best ones, of course, only the happy ones.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
she would annotate them very wittily. So it became a sort of ritual as we were growing up to keep going back to these albums and taking them off the shelves and turning the pages. And on the one hand, it reinforced our memories, I think, so that I often mistrust my memories. I have to ask myself, did that really happen? Or am I just remembering the photograph album? But the other thing it did was to show me at a very early age that there was an official version and that my memories perhaps weren't the official version. There was the nice version. And I see the same happening now with friends of mine who have children and who are on Instagram or Facebook. And they do these images, idyllic images of family trips and holidays and birthdays and whatever. And I think, well, God, that must be quite a strain for those children. Well, if they're aware that there is this shiny version going on, and possibly quite a strain for the husband or wife in that family, that everything has to be shiny and happy. I'm on social media, but I make a point of regularly doing posts that show, I don't know, the dog has been sick on a carpet or something, just to remind people it isn't all lovely.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to do some more of those.
They always get far more likes because people are so relieved to see that your life isn't perfect.
Yes, this is me with conjunctivitis, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
That's a good one.
No makeup, conjunctivitis, bad hair. Those always go down really well.
You are so brilliant at getting inside people's skin. And with everybody, in all the books I've read of yours, I can identify with them. I haven't experienced anything that they've experienced. I think, of course, they'd behave that way. And of course, that would be how they would react. And do you think that trauma that you had when you were younger then has made you more sensitive and more open to that? Or do you think you were born with just this huge dose of empathy?
I think being the youngest child definitely started me on that path. Because I think youngest children in big families quite often get a bit overlooked. Or people, if they're quiet, and I was a very quiet, studious little boy and quite sly, I suspect. I eavesdropped. I would often just sit very quietly behind the sofa and my mother would forget I was in the room, or my grandmother would, or whatever. And so I was made a party to conversations and discovered very early on they were completely fascinating. I think I maybe a bit earlier than most people, I did twig that there was this interesting dynamic and the relationships weren't straightforward. But the empathy thing, I don't know. I think that's what fiction is for. I get very upset now when I hear millennial writers fretting about feeling they shouldn't be writing books about people who aren't them. Because for me, writing and reading are the two halves of the same circle. It's the same process. And what you do when you write a novel, just as when you read a novel, is you lose yourself. You project yourself into other lives, other situations. And that's quite sort of dizzying for me as a writer. It gives me a big buzz, but I enjoy leaving myself behind. And as a reader, the same thing happens. You find yourself, as you said earlier, suddenly understanding people who are very remote from your own life. And scientists have done experiments on people, and they've taken a control group and done nothing but maths tests with them and made them read non-fiction. And they've got another group who've just read novels all day long. And they've done tests of their emotional intelligence before and after the experiment. And the fiction readers score more highly immediately after a dose of reading fiction. It just extends your sympathies and it helps you to empathize, makes you a better person. I think it should be compulsory for everyone to read novels on a regular basis. But there you go. Some people don't. It's very telling when you meet people who don't read fiction, especially men who say, oh, I don't have time for novels. And you think, well, that shows, actually.
Let's go to the mechanics of how you actually get these words on a page. Do you tend to start with an idea, a place, a character? Is there a formula that you have developed over the years?
There's no formula exactly. I often begin with a situation, like what happens to a family when the mother is periodically mad, but is also a genius. So with Notes from Exhibition, that was my starting point. I knew I wanted to write the most difficult mother I'd ever written. But what I will then do almost immediately is to simply focus on the characters. Who are the characters? And I grow the characters in note form for months often. I carry them around in my head, and I need to know a lot more about them that will end up on the page. But I need to know them back to front and upside down and what their childhoods were, all that. And only then, when I'm absolutely certain of who these people are, do I start thinking about plot. And often the plot by that point will have emerged organically out of the characters. Once you know what made somebody the way they were, you then think, oh, actually, well, that's quite an interesting story. I'll go down that route.
Do you write these things down as you go along, or do you just keep it in your head?
Well, I carry them around in my head for about 6 months to a year. So at the moment, I'm at that stage with my next novel. I'm carrying it in my head, just mulling it over, but I'm not committing anything to paper. I know roughly who the characters are, but no more than that. And then I do start to take notes, lots and lots of notes. And I do often a lot of research because I've never had a grown-up job. So I often have to research what the characters do and what that job involves. I'm very keen on researching place. So once I know where a book is going to be set, I will go and spend time in that place and just absorb it.
And just wander around?
Yeah, wander around, take lots and lots of photographs, read up on local history if the novel is historical, and just generally get a feel for it, because I like the place to feel vivid on the page. I like it to feel like a character almost. And only then do I start to write. And I have a theory that when writers complain about writer's block, it's because they've started too early. The book isn't ready yet. It's not yet cooked enough. And I always think of it like a compost heap. I just keep feeding the compost heap with ideas, with research, with other material. And I'll do that sometimes for up to a year before I actually write anything that becomes a novel. And the thing in my head when I finally start to write the fiction is just accuracy. I'm simply trying to be as accurate as I can. And that often means writing very simply and just saying how it is. And I'm very cinematic, I think, because by the time I'm writing the fiction, I've got a really clear series of images in my head. So what I'm doing really is taking dictation from an imaginary film that I can spool back and forth. It's I've likened it to a willed nervous breakdown, this process, because it is very odd. I know I'm going to have to make these people more real to me than my friends and family. Otherwise, they won't feel real to the reader. That process involves going very deep into myself and becoming rather detached from daily life. Luckily, my husband is a wonderful sculptor, and he similarly disappears into his work. So we both disappear off, and we know what the other one is up to and don't meddle. And then we'll meet for drinks and supper at the end of the day, and it's quite nice, really. But it's an odd way to make a living. And at the moment, you're talking to me when I'm at the other end of the journey, when the book is published, and I'm out meeting readers and talking to them about the new book. And I rather love that, because that's the point when I actually get feedback from readers on what the books mean to them and what's upset them and what they like and so on. And it's kind of reassuring in a way.
Well, it must be, because as you poured so much thought and love and care into it, and it's so isolating for such a long time because it's just you. Do you have someone that reads it as you're writing, or do you just keep it all to yourself until the very end?
I keep it all to myself, and usually when I'm on about the second draft and I've polished that a bit, I will finally send it to my agent and my editor. I don't have a trusted reader at home. My husband is a very good reader and I do trust him, but I tend to involve him later on when there's something more like a book to be read, because you only get your trusted reader's responses honestly once. Once they've read a version, they will always remember that version when they read a subsequent version. So you have to pick your time with care, I think.
And you don't suffer from writer's block, but do you ever, in your solitary phase, think, well, maybe this isn't interesting?
At moments, I have whole weeks of that. The inner critic never goes away. And I always pretend mine is a rather fierce little girl from my nursery school called Jennifer Woodcock. It helps if you somehow can project your inner critic into a person. So Jennifer Woodcock leans over my shoulder regularly and says, no one's going to want to read this. And it's devastating, but you have to learn to just ride it out and plow on.
I'm going to think of somebody for me. Then it doesn't seem quite so much that it's you.
It's not self-doubt. Exactly. Yes, it helps if it's somebody outside and you can argue with them and say, no, hang on, there's a good bit coming. Persevere. It's a good bit coming. It is difficult there, and there are passages in every book that are boring. Necessarily so. Writing is very like music, and sometimes when you know there's an amazing climax coming, you need to let things bumble along so the reader will be more shocked when the big thing happens. And that means quite dull. I mean, the writing itself isn't boring, but what you're writing about might be quite mundane. And you learn that gradually. I mean, when I look back at my early books, which I had to do when I recorded the audiobooks of them, I'm aghast because they're trying much too hard. The younger me was obviously just terrified at the thought that anybody would be bored for a moment. So he's constantly cracking jokes and showing off. And I've calmed down a lot as a writer. And part of that is learning to remember the reader and learning to remember that the reader will trust you and will go with you, and you can afford to be quiet sometimes.
What I think is incredibly clever is in a lot of your books, it's not in chronological order, it's multiple viewpoints. Do you write it that way?
Well, when I do a book like that with multiple viewpoints, what I tend to do is write all of one viewpoint at a time. So I stay in character, as it were. And then I will weave the viewpoints together at a later stage. I mean, Notes from an Exhibition and its sibling novel, A Perfectly Good Man, both have a very complicated structure. It's probably more evidently complicated to me than to the reader. I hope the reader isn't too aware of it, but they're actually double helixes. So one line of chapters is going forwards in time, and the other line of chapters is going backwards in time, and they spiral around each other. In both cases, what I was trying to do was what I imagined to be the process in psychotherapy or sort of Jungian analysis, where you're trying to get your patient to gradually pull back the layers and get to the dark heart of the thing that's troubling them. And in both those novels, there is a dark heart, but it takes us the whole novel to get to it. I often joke this, I am a sort of frustrated psychotherapist, which is why a lot of my novels have this rather therapeutic structure. But I've never been in therapy myself, so my knowledge of therapy is based entirely on old movies and plays and things.
You'd make a very good therapist because you managed to get inside people's heads so well. And in terms of mechanics, I did listen to an interview you did recently, and you don't write anything on a computer.
No, I'm a great believer in inky writing. And it took me several books to discover this, but I find with a pen in my hand, I write at a slow enough pace that I don't outstrip my thoughts. Whereas I'm a very fast typist. All those years of being taught to play the piano, I type much too quickly. So I frustrate myself if I try to do creative work at a typewriter, at a computer, and it becomes facile very quickly. But also what I love about inky writing is I can see my crossings out. And if you look at one of my manuscripts, you'll often see a word crossed out, a different word written, the new word crossed out, and the old word reinstated. And that's because I can see my first thoughts and reinstate them. The trouble with trying to be creative at a computer, I find, is that it's so easy to delete, and we all do it. I know you can officially select and cross through, but nobody bothers to do that. So it's all too easy to lose your first thoughts. And I think it's very helpful as well to see your workings. Do you remember when you were being taught maths in primary school? When you couldn't get long division right, the teacher would say, show your workings, and then I can see where you're going wrong. It's the same with a novel. If you can see your workings, sometimes you suddenly realize you've taken a wrong turning, and you can go back and see, oh, actually, my first thought was the right one. Let's go back to there and let's retrace from there. So it works for me. And whenever I taught creative writing weeks for the Arvin Foundation, I would always insist on one inky day. And people would moan and moan, and they'd say, oh, my hand hurts, my handwriting's so bad. But most of them at the end of the day would say, actually, I did good work today. Poets know this. A lot of poets work in ink. Novelists are reluctant, and this is an unfortunate thing that's, I think, entirely born of working at computers. They get very competitive about word counts, and I hear writers say, well, roughly, what's your word count on an average day? And it's pointless. It's just willy waving. I mean, I often will only write 3 sentences. That's all I've done. But they're sentences I'm really pleased with. And I'd rather do that than say, oh, I did 2,000 words. They were probably not very good words. So anyone listening to this, get a nice fountain pen and a beautiful exercise book and have a go, because it could be a revelation.
What about music? Do you write with music in the background?
Most of the time I do, yes. And I am very musical. I'm a cellist to this day. I discovered quite early on, though, that music is really useful when I'm writing. If I keep listening to the same handful of pieces when I'm writing a novel, it means that if I have to leave the novel for a week or two, when I come back, all I have to do is put on that Shostakovich string quartet or Beethoven opera or whatever it was I was listening to, and I'm back in the same place. It's like a very effective placeholder emotionally and psychologically. It works for me anyway. And the weird thing is, each book will then end up with this cluster of pieces I've been listening to, which have nothing to do with the book at all, often. It was strange, because actually my last novel, Take Nothing With You, is a novel about music. And yet the music I was listening to when I was writing it was not the music I was describing in the book at all. I was listening to Shostakovich symphonies obsessively. And the book is all about things like the Schubert string quintet and the Rachmaninoff cello stuff. So the book is about pieces I knew really, really well. So I didn't need to listen to them while writing them. Long answer to a short question. I write to music, but I do also love writing out of doors. And that's the other joy of inky writing. We live on a very, very beautiful farm at Land's End, and we have quite a good garden too. So I will often, on a nice day, take my manuscript outside, either into one of the fields by the sea or just a bench in the garden. And I don't listen to music then. I'll just have birdsong and that'll do.
Yes, that's probably the best music of all, actually. I think that's very, very inspiring. Well, let's go back to you. You leave school, Winchester, and you go to New College. Were you directed as a Wykehamist to go to New College?
They were very cunning. I was reading English. I wanted to read English. And our head of English at Winchester, he researched the different English tutors and the different colleges. And he paired us up with them according to what our enthusiasms were. And I was mad about acting by this point, and particularly keen on Shakespeare, Ben Jonson and Jacobean and that drama. And at that stage, the great Anne Barton was the senior tutor at New College. And that was one of her areas of expertise. So it was very cunning to send me to her, because inevitably I wrote about these authors and I enthused about them. And it worked, thank heavens. But what didn't work was there was in those days still a closed scholarship at New College that was only available to Wykehamists. And rather cruelly, I was told, well, my school was told afterwards, that I hadn't been awarded this scholarship because I was politically naive. They found. So heaven knows what that was. I was very full of myself. I was the editor of the Wykehamist, the school newspaper, and I wrote these appallingly sort of stick in the mud, conservative little essays, editorials, I suppose, which I thought were terribly funny. I mean, my toes curl with embarrassment thinking about them now. So I suspect in my general paper at Oxbridge, I wrote something similar that was just appalling. Now, I wish I could go back in time. I don't care about the scholarship, but I'd love to go back in time and correct what I wrote for that paper, probably. But the lovely thing was about coming to New College, I had done the complete William of Wykeham educational plan from the age of 7 to 21. I did the whole thing. So by rights, I should be a bishop by now.
Yeah, you should be. And what were your initial thoughts? Those first few weeks of being at New College, how did you find it?
Oh, I was just blown away by it. The buildings were almost immediately familiar because the main quad at New College and the chapel is very like Chamber Court, Winchester. It's almost the same building, though with grass instead of cobbles. And, the hall, all that was familiar. But what was intoxicating was women, because, the New College had been taking girls for one generation before me. So there were already plenty of them there. And my intake for English was almost entirely women. I think there were only 3 boys.
Oh, wow. That's unusual.
Oh, yes, but it was really exciting for me because I've always loved the company of women, and I hadn't known many women my own age. So that was enormous fun. And of course, I then got drawn into acting in a big way. And I neglected my studies appallingly for the next 2 years by just being I was in a play almost every term. I wanted to be an actor at this age, to the point where when I left Oxford, I applied to drama school. I auditioned for several drama schools in my last year at Oxford. And I did quite well. I got called back. I think the main reason I didn't get in, despite having second auditions at Bristol Vic and RADA, was I had this appalling tragedy, which was in the very middle of doing the auditions. The news came through that my brother Matthew had been killed in a car crash, aged 25. And I was so silly and proud. What I should have done was to ask New College to write a letter to the drama school saying, this has happened. Please give him a year and he'll re-audition in a year's time. But because you had to pay for the auditions, I clawed together this money. I didn't dare ask anybody. I just went and did them. And I think I was a bit mad with grief. I'm probably not a very effective performer. But with hindsight, I'm really glad I didn't get into drama school. Plenty of my contemporaries did and did really well and are now still professional actors, not least Hugh Grant, who was the year above the New College, and Imogen Stubbs, really good actors in that generation who are still doing very well. But I really didn't want that. I don't want that life at all. I don't miss it. I miss acting. I enjoyed acting, but I wouldn't have enjoyed being a professional actor.
Were you writing at that time? Because you went to New College in 1983 and your first books were published in 85. So was that while you were still there?
No, I went there in 1980. I was there from 80 to 83.
Okay.
So no, it was the least creative 3 years of my life.
Well, no, you were acting. That's creative.
I was acting. Yeah, all my creativity. I even stopped my cello. I sold my cello to pay for my battles bills and to pay for my drama school auditions. I focused entirely on drama. I did a bit of writing as a critic. I wrote film reviews and theatre reviews. I did love all the reading I was doing. And I think unwittingly what I was doing was studying to be a novelist. You can't have better models than the likes of George Eliot and Henry James. But no, I wasn't creative then. And when I left New College, I was still trying to be an actor and trying to get my equity card. And I wrote my early novels really to amuse myself, not with any view to them being likely to get a publisher. And funny enough, I got my agent thanks to acting, because one of my friends who was also trying to become an actor, she happened to be working as a secretary to a very good, it turns out, literary agent. And she, without telling me, slipped the manuscript of my first novel onto the pile of manuscripts he was taking home for the weekend. And he got in touch and said, I think we might be able to find you a publisher. Are there any more? And I said, no, not yet. It was by the time he found me a publisher, I had written my second novel. They were very, very slight, those early books, but bless him. And he is still my agent.
Oh, that's wonderful. And you stuck with him.
I've stuck with him ever since. Absolutely.
Well, ahead of this conversation, I spoke to my friend Lysander, who was at university with me and remains one of the sunniest people I have ever met. But knowing that you have been very open about being gay, and Lysander hid it when he was at university. And so we didn't know anything about it at all. And he said when I spoke to him this week, it took him years to pluck up the courage to admit it. I think he was in a family where he was brought up to believe that it was something unpleasant, something shameful. There were huge expectations on him to have a big wedding and have lots of children. And So the first word that came to his mind when I said, well, how was that experience for you at college? And he said it was painful. He had to hide and he was sort of live in fear of people finding out. And I just wondered how that experience was for you, whether you were as able to be free then as you are now.
I was incredibly lucky that I had a little gang of gay friends at Winchester College. From the age of 14 or so, we found each other. So there were 5 of us. So it meant that we kind of had our biological adolescence and our gay adolescence at the same time. The cliche, which is still the norm for many men and women, is they go through adolescence and then finally they dare to admit that they're gay or lesbian or whatever in their 20s, and they have this delayed adolescence later. I had them at the same time, which meant that when I arrived at New College, which was, ultra heterosexual for the most part, it was a kind of marriage market, really. I was aware there were gay people around, but I was incredibly impatient with them because they were all closeted. They were all like your friend Lysander. So I could tell they were what we would now call bi-curious, because they were interested to talk to somebody who was openly gay. But at the same time, they were obviously frightened by it. But I just kind of got on with it. I not only was it one of my least creative periods in terms of writing, it was also my least romantic period. I had no dewy-eyed Oxford romances at all. If ever I got a boyfriend when I was a student, I had to commute to London. All my boyfriends were in London because my own age group were less advanced, I suppose. They hadn't yet decided who they were and what they wanted to be. But people were very sweet. There were some very nice girls at New College with me who kind of took me under their wing. And I was like a kind of gay mascot to them, I suppose. They were very curious. They wanted to know what I was getting up to. And I used to go clubbing. There was a gay club in Oxford called The Coven, which was in a terrible kind of prefab out on the Oxpens Road. And a gang of us would go dancing at least one night a week. So I suppose I was in touch with gay culture without really being fully a part of it. And that stayed with me in a funny way. I've never really felt I yearned to be living in the middle of a gay community. And it shows in my books. I think I don't really write about urban gay life much. I write more about people who are just getting on with their lives in the countryside or in the bosom of their family who just happen to be gay. I think because that's been my experience in a way.
Going on to your screenwriting, you wrote this amazing film, which miniseries film. I watched it recently, and to anyone, stop doing whatever you are doing and watch Man in an Orange Shirt. I wept, and that actor James McArdle, who is Captain Thomas March, and he has the most extraordinarily vulnerable face and shining eyes.
He is heartbreaking in it, utterly heartbreaking.
He is heartbreaking. And you have those 2 episodes post the war when everything is hidden, as we were just talking about. And then the sort of present day when I thought, well, okay, now it's going to be fine. It's not a problem anymore. But actually, it's equally problematic. So even though you yourself didn't go through that heartbreak, you've obviously witnessed it with other people and it is heartbreaking.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Lysander is not alone. I mean, gay shame is still inculcated in boys and girls from a very early age. It's tough. It's very tough, and it's very hard to bear. And unfortunately, the gay culture currently for men, this is where, there are all these dating apps, endless dating apps. It's not very healthy, and it's very addictive, and it's not really about forming relationships. It's about instant gratification. And I see friends getting totally addicted to this. So I wanted to show in the modern episode that actually, although the law is kinder than it used to be, the culture arguably is no kinder, that there is still a problem. I wanted to explore homophobia through a female character, because the character of Flora, who is the young wife, all too innocent in the first episode, and the grandmother in the second episode, she has been profoundly damaged by being lied to and being married to a man who wasn't entirely heterosexual. And her homophobia, I wanted to show that it actually has emotional roots. It's not just somebody being nasty for the sake of being nasty. They really believe that this is a bad thing. I think it was important to show that it's far too easy to be simplistic about homophobia and make out that it's something you can just correct. Rather like racism, it is something that is taught and inculcated in people from such an early age that you have to work quite hard at unpicking it. I always say things have changed so much now that I regularly find myself invited to schools to talk to the LGBT group, 13, 12-year-old school children. Things have really changed, but I always say to them, however much you think you are out now, you must be aware you will be coming out every day of your life. It's just it's a constant process because you're in a minority. People will always assume that you are like them, and it's up to you. But you will find often, with a taxi driver, with a person cutting your hair, whatever, that you have to pull them up short and say, no, hang on, I need to correct you.
And
there.
That takes strength.
I'm not who you think I am. Well, it takes strength. It takes a certain amount of self-belief. And sometimes, frankly, I can't be bothered. And I just let them believe what they want to believe.
Most memorable new college moment. Do you have one?
Oh, I probably do. And it's actually a literary one. In my very first term at New College, very mysteriously, I was invited to a literary dining society. And to this, I've never found out who invited me. And it didn't happen in New College. It happened at, was it Trinity? The one with the beautiful gardens. Yes, Trinity.
Yes, Trinity's.
Well, and that's right. And the guest of honor was Iris Murdoch. And at this point, I hadn't read any Iris Murdoch. And she gave a talk before dinner, and then we all went to dinner. And the talk was absolutely beguiling. And then at dinner, to my horror, I found I was sat right next door to her. And I thought, God, what do I do? And I thought, I have to be honest. So I turned to her and said, Dame Iris, I have to come clean and say that I haven't yet read any of your novels. I'm reading English, so I'm reading all these 19th century things, 18th century things. And she was enchanting and just said, well, thank God for that. We could talk about something else. What interests you? And so, we talked about family dynamics, and we talked about gardening and red wine and all sorts, anything but her novels. But I was so in love with her by the end of the evening. Of course, I then went away and read Iris Murdoch's entire output to date. And it shows, I think, my early novels are very, very heavily influenced by her. So that was a really special thing that Oxford gave me. And as I say, I have no idea which guardian angel invited me to that dinner, but I'm very glad they did.
Some of these things are meant to be, aren't they? And then quite soon after college, your first two books are published in the same year. And had you already moved to Cornwall then?
No, I was living in a little bedsit, and then I was living in a rented bedroom in a friend's flat in Holland Park. And when the first two novels came out of the blue, my agent contacted me and said, did I fancy going to chateau sit for an eminent musicologist in France? One of his clients was the great Haydn musicologist, H.C. Robbins Landon. And Robbie had this, well, it was called a chateau. It wasn't really. It was a big hunting lodge. But it was in the middle of nowhere in southwest France, in a village where nobody spoke a word of English. They barely spoke French. It was so kind of Occitan in that region. And I had this amazing, about 10 months, living in this place, feeding the cats. My only duties, other than feeding the cats, were once a day, I had to play the piano, which had belonged to Haydn. So it was a really beautiful Longman and Broadrip early pianoforte. And I had to play the harpsichord to keep it in good heart. It was a really special time. And I think it was during that period out in France that I realized I didn't want to live in London. The countryside really suited me. And very soon after, I moved back to London at the end of that period. Quite by chance, I fell madly in love with a guy who had to move to Cornwall for his work. So we went to Cornwall together, and I just stayed.
And whereabouts in Cornwall did you go?
We started in North Cornwall, so near where Rough Music is set, in fact, in a tiny little town called Camelford.
Oh, yes, I know. I've driven through Camelford.
Everyone,
Yes.
That's the tragedy of Camelford. Everyone drives through it. They might stop at the co-op on their way to somewhere nicer. Yeah. It's a rather blighted little town, but it was so cheap that on my tiny income, I could afford a 3-bedroom house with a sizable garden. So it was a lovely start. And I loved the landscape there. I got involved in the wonderful music festivals at St. Endellion nearby, which I'd gone to as a little boy. I'd gone to sing at them. So it was a lovely reconnecting with my very early experiences of Cornwall. Then after about 8 or 9 years, I met Aidan, my husband, who was farming on his family farm right down at Land's End. People never believe me, but Cornwall is 2 hours long. So yeah, he was 2 hours west of where I was living, and farmers can't move. So once we realized we were getting on, I sold my house and moved all the way down there and became kind of a farmer by default. So I had to learn to drive a tractor and round up cattle. And it was fun. It was great fun. And I had a permanently bad back because we were harvesting cauliflowers, which we were growing. And that's really hard work. But it's very hard to describe. But I think when you finally become happy, really happy, you realize that all the time before then, you were only pretending. And that was very much what happened to me. And that's why the first novel I wrote after meeting him was Rough Music, which is a novel about a man who thinks he's happy, but actually he's not. He's skating over the surface. And it's about that process of reinvestigating your own life and realizing that your happiness isn't what you thought it was.
Yeah, well, I love Cornwall. As we spoke before, and I grew up going to Polzeath Beach, which is where Rough Music and that cottage is. And there is something, whether it's nostalgia or just the stark beauty of the place, it does something to your soul.
It's true. And the other thing about it, quite apart from the beauty, is just the fact that it is so full of creative people, that being a creative for a job is normalized, which I think is very healthy. So, I've got a composer and a poet and a potter and a painter, and I have a sculptor living in the same house. So you don't get ideas above your station. You think, okay, it's a job. My job happens to be writing novels, but you're never put on a pedestal, which is fatal, I think, for any creative person. It's much better just to get on with the job.
Your latest book, Mother's Boy, is again set in Cornwall, and it's based on the life of the poet Charles Causley and Timothy Winters. I reread Timothy Winters the other day, and through his breeches, the blue winds blow. And you're also patron of the Charles Causley Trust. So what made you decide to write that book? Well,
through working for the Trust, I had to sort of do my homework. When they invited me to become a director of the Trust, I said, well, I'm a novelist. I'm not a poet. Surely you want a poet. And they, by this stage, had seen that I was quite bossy and quite involved in the arts in Cornwall. And I think they could see I might be a useful person. So they persisted in inviting me. And once I agreed to become a member of the Trust, I then felt I must do my homework. And I started rereading Charles's poems. And I got more and more fascinated by them because they're so ambiguous. On the face of it, a lot of them have a surface charm or bits of narrative, but there's a much darker thing going on in the background to a lot of them. And so I started looking at his life, and that really fascinated me because I think he is the least sexy, least dramatic poet of the entire English canon. There are no suicidal wives. There's no alcoholism, no madness. On the face of it, he leads a life that's unbelievably undramatic. He lives with his mother until she dies. He teaches in the local primary school. He is unimpeachable. And of course, the novelist in me, that's a red rag to a bull. I thought,
yeah, that can't be right.
That can't be all there is. And whenever anybody asked him, Charles, why don't you write your memoirs? He always said, I don't need to, because it's all in the poems. And I took that as my cue. I went back to the poems, and suddenly I saw there were one or two, notably Angel Hill and Demolition Order, where you think, actually, this is deeply, deeply personal. It's a deeply personal statement disguised as something more general, as a ballad or a funny story or whatever. And then I started spending time in the Causley archive where all his manuscripts are kept. And there are private diaries there and there are letters. And my suspicions about him became confirmed. And I realized this is a man who, a bit like Proust, did all his living, all his dramatic living in quite a concentrated period. And for Proust, it was his early years. For Charles, it was the Navy. He was in the Navy for 5 years. And he never went to university. He went to teach training college after the Navy. But he always said, oh, the Navy was my Eton, my Harrow, my Oxford, and my Cambridge. He learnt everything in the Navy. And again, that's a typical Charles statement because it's skating over the surface of what he was actually saying, which was that when he was in the Navy, he did all his living. He had relationships. He met people wildly different to himself. He saw the world. He saw Gibraltar. He saw Malta. He saw Australia. He saw death and violence. He saw appalling things. And he suffered the most devastating tragedy, which was to be the only survivor of a ship that was torpedoed and sunk with all hands lost. And I think he never got over that survivor's guilt. One of his earliest really devastating war poems is Rattle and Morgan, which is a sort of pseudo-Shakespearean elegy, which he wrote within days, I believe, of receiving the news that the eclipse had been sunk. One of the things that fascinates me about Charles, quite apart from the mystery of his emotional life, which I've tried to flesh out in this novel, is the fact that he's a Second World War poet. Most of our poets, our war poets, are from the First World War, and most of them are public school, or the very least went to university. They read Ovid, they read Virgil, and it shows in their poems. Charles's war poems are from the Second World War, they're from the Navy, not the Army, and crucially, they're written from a working class point of view. They're rough-edged. They don't have that Ovidian or Virgilian pattern to them. They're different, and they're honest and frank in a way the First World War poets are not quite so frank, I think. You can hear the passion in my voice. I'm a passionate proselytizer for Charles Causley. I wish he was in Poets' Corner at Westminster. He should be. I'm glad he wasn't made Poet Laureate. His friend Ted Hughes was instead, because I think that wouldn't have suited Charles. But he should be on the curriculum. He should be taught. He should be up there with T.S. Eliot, and I'm doing all I can to make sure he gets there.
Well, you're doing a good job. You are. You are doing a good job with it.
When I embarked on this novel, I did go back to my colleagues on the Trust and said, look, I want to write a novel about Charles, but I need to warn you, I think I'm probably going to do the equivalent of outing him. I will give him a sex life. I will show that he probably wasn't a virgin. And they were delighted because they could see that the very fact of this extreme respectability, this outward veneer, which he had carefully constructed in the course of his life, was threatening to kill off his reputation. Because we're childish readers. We like to have a story to go with what we're reading. And Charles needs a story, and that's what I've written, I hope.
Well, it's a fantastic story. And I started listening to it on Audible. It's the first book that I have actually listened to. And it's so lovely because it's your voice and
accents and all.
Brilliant accents. And so now the books that I read of yours have your voice as well, which is really lovely.
Oh, that's lovely.
I was listening to it with my husband, Simon, as we were driving through Switzerland, actually. And then I thought, well, I'll just carry on listening to it myself. And he said, you cannot listen to this without me. And so we've sort of gone back to in the evenings, listening to a couple of chapters. And what a lovely thing that is to do. So I haven't got to that bit on the ship yet, but we are absolutely gripped. The detail that you go into, and you just feel like you're walking alongside him every step of the way, which is really wonderful. Okay, I know I'm keeping you here for a really long time when I said I was only going to take you an hour. But there's just so many things I want to ask. If you couldn't write for the day or be on a book tour or being interviewed, what would your perfect day be?
That's incredibly easy. I think my perfect day, I would spend the entire day gardening. Our garden takes about 4 days to weed from one corner to the other. I could very easily spend a whole day on my knees, weeding and tidying and feeding the compost heap. And then in the evening, I would like there to be an orchestral rehearsal in Penzance. So I would put my cello in the car, drive into Penzance and play a symphony all evening. That would be the perfect day for me.
At what age did you become interested in gardening?
Quite young, because my parents were both keen gardeners. And one of the advantages of being a prison governor in those days was that you had not only a great big house, you had a great big garden to go with it. So I've got very, very early memories of being kind of mesmerized by rose bushes. My mother always had these, she always did the same planting combination, which I've recreated in my garden, which is old-fashioned roses underplanted with catmint, because the bees go mad for the catmint. So you have this lovely combined scent of the roses, the scent of the catmint, and the buzzing of the bees. It's a perfect combination.
What's next? Because I know there are lots of things in the pipeline. There's films, musicals, plays.
I'm working on 2 separate plays. One is a play based on my last novel, Take Nothing With You. That's the novel about the cello playing child. And I'm devising that with a very exciting young director at Bristol Old Vic. And that's definitely going to happen because there's money behind it. And the other play I'm working on is a musical based on the scripts for Man in the Orange Shirt. But I've completely restructured them so you get the 2 stories on stage simultaneously. They overlap with each other. The same actors play more than one character. So you can actually have a character from one story singing a duet with a character from the other story. And the next novel I'm going to work on is going to be a sequel to A Place Called Winter. So this will be another historical drama set in 1953, and it'll be about 2 marriages, my grandmother's marriage and my mother's marriage. So very cheekily, I'm going to write a novel in which I am related to all the characters.
Oh my goodness, that's very exciting. Well, thank you so much for your time today. And I have to tell you that my perfect day has changed because of you, because now my perfect day, I think, would be reading one of your books on Polzeath Beach, not in the height of summer, but empty beach, sunny day, then going for a walk on the Rumps, and then finishing with perhaps Man in an Orange Shirt at the Minack Theatre. I think that would be pretty special.
Pull my finger out and make it happen.
Thanks so much. I can't tell you how lovely it's been to talk to you today. You've been listening to Bandwidth Conversations. Thanks to Anna B., Head of Marketing, to Matthew Passy and all at the podcast consultant, to Bagawire for the music, to the Money Maze podcast. Thank you for listening. Any feedback, please email me, katie@bandwidthconversations.com. Please sign up on our website, www.bandwidthconversations.com, so we can notify you about new podcast releases. We hope to see you again soon.